My name is Ivy, and I'm 35 years old. I'm the head chef and co-founder of a newly opened fine dining restaurant in the suburbs of Chicago. A restaurant named after my mother, the only person who ever truly believed I could create something for myself. That evening, soft golden lights glowed on shimmering glasses of wine, guests dressed elegantly, and the piano played a gentle tune. I stepped onto the stage to applause from those who had walked alongside me, people who genuinely cared. And then the tall doors at the back swung open. My father and younger brother entered, wearing suits as though they had never cursed me as a useless thing who belongs nowhere but the kitchen. They smiled, they waved, they walked toward me as if we were some happy family. I took the microphone and smiled calmly. Do you know, these are the very people who once told me, you don't deserve to go to college because your brother needs the money more. But tonight, they've come to ask to be my business partners. The entire hall froze. Have you ever had your own family crush your dreams, only to return with fake smiles once you've succeeded? Comment if you've ever been rejected. Like and subscribe to follow me on this journey of exposing those who once trampled on trust, on family. Because the story behind my mother's portrait is longer than you think. I was born and raised in a small town in Ohio, where everyone knew each other, where weekend baseball games were the pride of the community, and where my father, Michael Carter, was called a legend. He had been a professional baseball player, tall, commanding, with a voice that carried. But for him, the only thing worth being proud of wasn't titles, it was having a son to carry on his name. And unfortunately for me, I wasn't that child. From the time I was little, I was different. While the neighborhood kids raced around with baseball gloves, I quietly flipped through the baking book my mother had given me, or sat for hours by the stove, taking notes on how she seasoned dishes. I loved flour, the clatter of pans, the aroma of a stew simmering all afternoon, and the tender moment when my mother brushed my hair back and smiled softly. You have the hands of someone who knows how to love. My mother, Sophia, wasn't flashy like my father, but she was the only place in that house where I ever felt safe. Whenever Dad shook his head at me for being useless, she would take me into the kitchen. Together we cooked, building a small world of our own. Brandon, my younger brother, could throw a ball as soon as he could walk. At every little league game, Dad stood front row, clapping as if cheering for a national team. And whenever anyone asked, he'd beam with pride. He's the future of the Carters. And me? I stood on the sidelines clutching a notebook, hearing him say bluntly to anyone within earshot, "That girl just plays with pots and pans. Nobody needs a cook in this house." I never understood why he despised me so much. Maybe because I wasn't loud, aggressive, or competitive like Brandon. I didn't play sports, didn't argue, didn't break things. I just liked standing beside my mother, chopping vegetables carefully, learning how she folded dumplings for holidays. But every time Dad saw me laughing with her in the kitchen, he'd bark, "Get out of there. That's not for you, it's not for a boy, and not for a girl with no future either." Once, after spilling milk, I hid in the corner of the kitchen, sobbing from his scolding. Mom pulled me into her arms, wiped my tears with her apron, and whispered, "It's all right. Every good dish must pass through fire, and so will you." I carried those words with me for years. When I was in 8th grade, my mother fell ill. Her heart weakened slowly, and no one seemed to notice. Dad was busy coaching the youth baseball team. Brandon was busy training to make the state team. Only I saw that she started gasping after cooking, that her hands trembled while cutting onions, that she quietly took pills in her room while the rest of us ate dinner. I once asked Dad gently, "Don't you think Mom should see a doctor?" He waved me off. "She's just tired from cooking. Don't make a fuss." One winter morning, I woke early to make pancakes for her, but I never got to wish her good morning again. She collapsed on the sofa, a book unfinished in her hand. The day she died, our already cold house froze completely. Nobody spoke. Brandon was given a week off practice. Dad didn't shed a single tear. I saw him stand stiff in front of her photo, lips pressed tight, then turn away, leaving me alone with the emptiness. From then on, I had no one to talk to. Dad grew even more distant. Brandon treated me like a stranger. I retreated into the only refuge I had, the kitchen. After school, I experimented with recipes, took notes, adjusted techniques. I wasn't doing it to impress anyone. I cooked because I missed her, because it gave me a reason to keep going. But even that wasn't safe. One afternoon, while I was baking cookies, Dad came home early. He frowned. "What are you doing?" "Cookies, Mom's favorite," I answered softly. He glared as if I'd insulted him. "Enough! If I see you hanging around this kitchen again, don't bother eating dinner. If you want to cook, go get hired as some restaurant servant. This is a house, not a diner." I said nothing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I calmly opened the oven, set a cookie on a plate, placed it by Mom's photo, and walked out without looking back. That day, I realized I had no place in that house anymore except for the memories of Mom in that old kitchen. And I also began to understand what she had whispered. Sometimes, to live as yourself, you must first accept the pain inflicted by those closest to you. But that was only the beginning. I received the scholarship email on an early autumn afternoon. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen window onto the words, "Congratulations, you have been awarded a partial scholarship to the New York Culinary Institute." My heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo in the quiet room. I stared at the screen, fingers trembling on the keyboard, unable to type a word. It was the school I had always dreamed of, the place that produced chefs I had admired during countless late nights watching old cooking shows. I had nothing but passion and years of self-teaching, but I applied anyway. Maybe because some part of me still believed in the dream Mom had planted. That night, I printed the admission letter, clipped it with the scholarship notice, and brought it to Dad. He sat watching sports news, eyes glued to the screen. I waited for a commercial, then spoke. "I'd like to talk." "Go ahead," he said flatly, not turning his head. I held out the papers. "I got a partial scholarship to the New York Culinary Institute. I just need the rest of the tuition. I promise I'll work to cover my living expenses." He didn't look away from the TV, just skimmed the page. "How much?" "Total tuition is $40,000 a year. The scholarship covers nearly half. I need about $23,000. It can be split by semester." He finally set the remote down, squinting at me. "You think I'll pay that kind of money so you can learn how to cook?" I clenched my fists, steadying my voice. "This isn't a fantasy anymore. The school accepted me. It's a prestigious program, and I'll work for the rest." He was silent for a few seconds, then let out a dry, bitter laugh I'd never heard. "You expect me to fund you becoming a chef? While Brandon struggles with his grades, can't secure a sports scholarship, and needs me to pay for college?" I froze. "You mean because of Brandon I can't go?" He nodded without hesitation. "I won't let him feel inferior. If you go to New York with a diploma from that famous school, he'll think I don't believe in him. I won't let my only son feel that way." My throat burned. "I'm your child too. You know I wanted a son to carry on the Carter name. But you're not that child. Don't complicate things further." I swallowed back tears. "Do you ever think about what Mom would say if she knew you were denying me just because you were afraid Brandon might feel insecure?" His eyes darkened. "Don't bring Sophia into this. If she were alive, she wouldn't want Brandon put in that position either." I said nothing more. I went to my room, packed quietly. No tears, no anger, just something breaking inside me for good. That night, I stood at Aunt Carol's door, clutching a small suitcase and Mom's old cookbooks. She opened it with surprise and concern. "Ivy? What are you—" "Dad refused?" I whispered, trying not to let my voice shake. I can't stay there anymore. She didn't ask further. She simply stepped aside and opened the door wider. Come in, child. Her house had only 2 bedrooms, modest and plain, but I could finally breathe. She handed me a cup of hot tea, sat me at the wooden kitchen table. The scent of mint rose softly, like Mom's hand once did. When I finished telling her, she was silent for a long while. At last, she said quietly, "Your mother once told me if Ivy ever has nowhere to go, open the door, because she won't ask for much, but she won't beg either." My head dropped, tears splashing into the tea. Aunt Carol patted my shoulder. "I don't have much money, but if you're determined, we'll find a way." 3 days later, she started calling friends, old classmates, anyone who once knew Mom. Some gave a few hundred, some sent $10 from another state. She knocked on every door, not out of pity, but because she believed I deserved the chance. One rainy afternoon, after a long call with an old accounting friend, she turned to me with eyes glistening. They agreed. "Enough for your first semester. We'll figure out the rest later." I ran into her arms, speechless. The dream I thought had died in my father's living room was lit again from a tiny kitchen, an old phone, and a woman who never forgot her promise to her late sister. I arrived in New York on a chilly morning in late August. No one waited at the station, no signs, no flowers. Just me, a worn suitcase, and the admission letter tucked in Mom's recipe notebook. I dragged it through unfamiliar streets, weaving between honking cars and cold glass towers. The culinary dorms weren't big, but they were clean and quiet enough to start over. That first night, I sat by the window, watching sunset spill across the red brick rooftops. In my head was only Mom's voice. "Live true to your dream, no matter who calls it foolish." Classes began early 6 a.m., sharp in the practice kitchen. The instructors were strict, leaving no room for hesitation. Every step had to be exact, from slicing onions paper thin to whipping egg whites at the right speed. I wasn't great at first. My hands shook, my heart raced when called to present a dish, but I never let myself stop. After class, I worked shifts at a small cafe a few blocks away. I carried trays, wiped tables, washed dishes. Some days the cold wind cut through my collar and my feet ached after 10 hours on them, but I never asked for a day off. Aunt Carol sent exactly what she'd promised. The rest I covered myself. I once thought exhaustion was the worst, until I realized loneliness is heavier. I had no friends at school. Most came from wealthy families, with relatives in the culinary world, able to reserve fine dining seats like ordering pizza. And me? I sat quietly in the back, taking notes not only on recipes but on the chef's expression when tasting. Then I went home and practiced alone in a tiny kitchen. One evening, while I was scrubbing a pile of pans caked with butter and sauce, the cafe owner Lynn walked in and handed me a paper bag. "This is for you. Apple tart." I saved a slice. I opened it and the gentle scent of cinnamon rose up, stinging my eyes. "I see how hard you work. Someone like you deserves dessert." I bowed my head in thanks, saying nothing more. In that kitchen, with that warm paper bag and her kind hand, I felt something close to family for the very first time. Every month, I sent Aunt Carol a handwritten letter. I wrote about new lessons, dishes I was learning, and kind strangers like Lynn. She didn't use social media or own a smartphone, but she always wrote back in her familiar rounded handwriting. In every letter, she reminded me, "Your mother would be so proud if she could see you now." 2 years passed in what felt like a sigh. I kept my grades at the top of my class. In the spring of my second year, there was an internal interview for an internship at La Lumiere in Chicago, a restaurant that had held 3 consecutive Michelin stars. Only one position was available, and more than 50 students applied. I didn't have high hopes. My resume was strong, my grades were excellent, but I had no connections, no recommendations. Still, I applied, attaching a handwritten note about the very first dish I ever cooked for my mother. Roast chicken with honey mustard sauce. A week later, I was called in for an interview. The executive chef Laurent was French, with graying hair and eyes sharp as a blade. He asked, "Why do you want to join La Lumiere?" I answered without hesitation. Because I need to understand where my limits are, and because I need to know if the endurance and faith I've carried for years can become something of value. He stared at me for a long moment, neither smiling nor nodding. Then he simply stood up and said, "We start the morning shift at 4:30. Don't be late." I was accepted. My first day at La Lumiere tested me in every way. Everyone moved like a storm, no complaints, no one out of rhythm. I stood at the vegetable prep station, my knife work lagging behind the pace around me. Laurent passed by, glanced at my cutting board, and said coldly, "If you let the vegetables soak more than 5 seconds, you can go home." I didn't go home. I woke at 3:30 a.m., stood for 12 hours without a lunch break, my hands cracked from cold water, my legs numb so badly that I collapsed onto the dorm floor when I returned. But I learned things no classroom could teach me: speed, precision, and absolute respect for every ingredient. Laurent wasn't warm, but he was fair. One day, he approached while I was cooking risotto. He silently tasted a spoonful, then set the spoon down. A little heavy on the seasoning. But the rice is cooked evenly. Not bad. That short sentence felt like a ray of light piercing my chest. I was asked to stay after the internship ended. It was unprecedented for a student from a small culinary school like mine. Laurent said, "You have flaws, but you don't run. This industry needs people like that." That evening I called Aunt Carol, standing on the balcony after my shift, my old phone trembling in the wind. She was silent on the line for a long time, then whispered, "Your mother is smiling." I looked up at the starry sky, my heart a little lighter. I wasn't at my destination yet, but I hadn't lost my way, and I would never turn back. Soon after graduation, I started working full-time at La Lumiere. Chef Laurent didn't hold a ceremony, didn't give a speech, or send a letter. He simply came up to me during a short break on a busy night, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Tomorrow, you don't wear an intern's coat anymore. Take the chef's jacket from locker 8. I nodded, no questions. In this world, being given an opportunity meant proving it was worth it. I understood that better than anyone. Shifts stretched from noon until nearly midnight. I was in charge of the hot station, high pressure, demanding speed, juggling 3 to 4 orders at once. Some nights I felt like I was running purely on instinct, turning, seasoning, plating until I looked up and saw it was nearly 2 a.m. In that relentless rhythm, I found 2 colleagues who became kindred spirits, Lucas and Emily. Lucas was a sous chef from Texas, 4 years older, quiet but meticulous with every detail. Emily was the opposite, Boston-born, blonde hair always tied high, voice quick as wind, but her knife skills were like a dance. We often sat together after shifts, eating leftover bread with cold black coffee. One night, Emily looked at me, fatigue still in her eyes, and asked, "Ivy, if you ever open your own restaurant, what would you call it?" I thought for a moment, then replied, "Sophia's Table," because my mother was the first to teach me to put my whole heart on the table. Lucas nodded slightly, sipping his coffee. "Good name. If that day comes, remember to let me run the pastry station." We all laughed, but none of us treated it as a joke. Amid the grind of work, that small dream quietly grew. I spent nearly 4 years at La Lumiere. The skills, discipline, and steel-like spirit the restaurant forged in me were irreplaceable. But the longer I stayed, the more restless I felt. Some afternoons, standing in the cold storage among trays of perfectly measured meat, I asked myself, can I step out of here without fear? I didn't leave abruptly. I prepared carefully. Every paycheck was divided into 3 parts: one for savings, one to send Aunt Carol each month, and the rest to study business skills, laying a foundation for something bigger. Aunt Carol never asked how much I made, never demanded repayment. But I knew I had to do it not out of duty, but because without her, my dream would have ended at the New York train station. I'm sending you some money to Axedo. Fix the roof. I wrote in a note inside an envelope. Please don't refuse, because I still owe so much. She wrote back only one line. I don't accept repayment. I accept the promise you kept. One evening, while wiping down the counter with Lucas, he asked, "Remember that promise?" I turned to him, smiling. "I haven't forgotten, and maybe it's time to take it seriously." We started meeting after shifts, no longer to complain or drink coffee, but to plan. Emily joined as soon as she heard about opening a restaurant inspired by American family meals blended with refined European style. Together, we built a model, researched finances, chose a location. I suggested returning to Ohio, not my father's town, but a suburb west of Chicago, a growing community where I felt I could rewrite everything. Lucas agreed immediately. Emily studied me for a moment, then nodded. "And the restaurant will carry your mother's name?" I replied without hesitation. "Yes, Sophia's Table." Because that table, though small, once kept my childhood from breaking apart. The plan moved slowly but surely. We found an old building that used to be a family tailoring shop, with sturdy timber framing and enough foundation to restore. I invested most of my savings for the deposit and borrowed the rest from a small bank Aunt Carol recommended where she had saved for decades. On the day I signed the long-term lease, I video called Aunt Carol holding up the wooden sign, "Sophia's Table, opening soon." She smiled, her hand trembling against her chest. "Your mother must be sitting at that table right now, looking down, saying, 'That stubborn girl. She really did it.'" I laughed through tears in the cool autumn air of Chicago. I didn't yet know how many guests would come, how many orders we'd serve, or how many harsh reviews awaited. But one thing I believed: anything built on gratitude and determination will stand firm. And I had laid that foundation with swollen hands, nights curled up in a damp room, and mornings rising before the city woke to cook meals no one ever saw. I returned to Ohio on a gentle April morning, with sunlight and the faint scent of apple blossoms. The rental car stopped in front of an old building at the end of Main Street, once an Italian family's tailor shop. The roof tiles were mossy, windows fogged with dust, faded hand-painted letters still clinging to the wooden sign. But as I stepped out, placed my hand on the rusted handle, and looked around the quiet street, I felt as though the place had been waiting for me. The building had been on the market since the year before. I spotted it in a small local real estate ad. Not glamorous, not convenient, but when I saw its photo, I felt something strange. It wasn't beautiful, but it had a soul. Not large, but it carried the air of memories. I sent the photo to Lucas and Emily with one short question. "Shall we?" They answered in under a minute, "Absolutely." We flew back to inspect it and quickly signed the contract. Renovations took nearly 8 months, longer than expected due to the weak interior foundation. But with the help of local workers and a young architect I'd met at La Lumiere, we preserved the original wooden frame, reused old bricks for the walls, keeping the soul of the place while meeting modern standards. The new sign went up on a winter morning. As light snow drifted down, I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the walnut wood plaque carved by hand. "Sophia's Table." No flashing lights, no trendy logo. Just a name and a simple line beneath, a place to come home to. Aunt Carol arrived early, carrying a basket with my mother's old kitchen towels. She said nothing, just placed it carefully on the new bar counter, covering it with an embroidered cloth of olive branches. I touched the stitches, my chest tight. She said softly, "Set this here so Sophia has a seat next to you." Local media responded with surprising excitement. a restaurant founded by three chefs returning from New York, inspired by traditional American meals and European technique, in a small town with little else to boast of. The regional paper wrote a feature titled, Sophia's Table, Where Memories Become Meals. Food blogs picked up the story, reservations filled for 2 weeks before we even opened. On opening night, I prepared everything down to the smallest detail. Lucas handled the entrees, Emily took desserts. I coordinated everything: table settings, background music. We didn't hire an MC, didn't hand out flyers, didn't invite celebrities. The guest list was just 40 people. Aunt Carol, my old English teacher, Lynn from the cafe, the warehouse manager who once let me take leftover bread home without docking my pay. I wrote every invitation by hand, in dark blue ink, with careful strokes, no printing, no couriers. I wanted them to know this wasn't just a restaurant opening, it was a thank you. Some asked why I didn't invite my father and Brandon. I only smiled, not because I was still angry, but because some people, after years of silence, no longer deserve a seat at the table they once scorned. I still remember clearly the day I pulled my suitcase out of that house, standing in the pale golden sunset in the yard, hearing my father close the door without a word. And I also remember the day I mailed my graduation announcement and no one replied. No call, no congratulations, not even a glance acknowledging who his daughter had become. But I didn't carry resentment into that night. I didn't let it seep into the wine glasses, the tablecloth, or the roast chicken I had prepared just for Aunt Carol. Guests arrived early. A warm atmosphere spread beneath the golden candlelight, with the scent of fresh bread and red wine filling the air. Some brought flowers, others brought old books, and some came simply to shake my hand and say, "I heard your story. Thank you for sharing it." I stood behind the counter, looking around the room full of people who had believed in me back when I had nothing, and I thought quietly, maybe my mother is seeing this. Maybe she's here somewhere, her hand resting on the embroidered olive branch cloth, smiling. But I didn't know that only a few hours later, two uninvited guests would appear, carrying a portrait and wearing smiles I had never seen in my entire childhood. And I couldn't have guessed that what they came to say wasn't congratulations. The grand opening began at 6 p.m. The lights in the restaurant were dimmed just enough to create warmth, the smell of butter and herbs floating gently in the air. I stood behind the bar with Lucas and Emily, watching familiar faces enter with kind eyes and welcoming smiles. Laughter trickled through the room, glasses clinked, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything was truly at peace. Until the door opened. I was pouring wine for one of my mother's old friends when I noticed everyone's gaze shift toward the entrance. A few murmurs rippled through the room. I lifted my head, and it felt as though the blood in my body froze. Standing in the doorway, under startled and quiet stares, were Michael, my father, and Brandon, my brother. They weren't dressed as elegantly as the other guests, but every move they made was calculated. Michael wore a pale gray knit coat, holding a large framed painting wrapped in silk. Brandon carried a small bouquet of flowers, his head slightly bowed, as if he knew he wasn't welcome but still tried to step in looking polite. I didn't call staff to stop them. I didn't leave my place. I just stood still, a sharp ache pressing in my chest, cold and hollow. Brandon stepped forward first, smiling hesitantly, as if searching for forgiveness he had never asked for. "Hi, Ivy. I know you're surprised, but we just wanted to come and congratulate you. The restaurant is beautiful." I didn't reply, only looked him straight in the eye. Michael followed closely, placing the framed painting on a table near the bar. I read the news, those articles about the restaurant, about the name, Sophia's Table. I knew immediately it had to be you, no one else. His voice tried to sound emotional. But what trembled inside wasn't love, it was something I no longer wanted to name. We brought a gift. Brandon unwrapped the silk, revealing a half-length oil portrait of my mother. The lines were soft, her eyes tilted as if watching someone beyond the frame. I froze, not from emotion but from surprise. Why did they still have that painting? Your father had it restored by a painter from one of her old photos, Michael said, his eyes on me. He thought, it should belong to you, and that it should hang here, because this is Sophia's table. I set down the wine glass. A few people around us started paying attention. Emily quietly moved to stand beside me, her eyes worried but silent. I looked at the painting, then at the two men standing before me. Brandon quickly jumped in, his tone light, almost joking. Maybe you could let me be a partner, Ivy? After all, this is a family restaurant, right? You already have two great chefs like you and your friends. I could handle management. I've got some experience from that old bar gig, remember? I stared at him for a long moment. Brandon immediately dropped his gaze. I turned to my father. What did you both think would happen when you walked in here? I asked, my voice steady. That I would cry, touched by the painting, that I'd forget everything from the past just because of one night like this? Michael didn't answer. Brandon forced a smile. We just want to reconnect a little. Nothing bad. Nothing bad, I repeated, nodding slowly. Like when you refused to pay my tuition because you didn't want Brandon to feel inferior? Like when neither of you bothered to make a single phone call during all those years I was in New York and then Chicago? The room grew still. Whispers faded. Everyone began to fall silent, watching me. Michael said quietly, "That's all in the past, Ivy. Now you're successful. Can't you be a little forgiving?" I tilted my head, half smiling. The past you speak of is what I had to carry. I was forgiving enough when I left home without a dime, when I worked 12-hour days to pay tuition, when I stood in freezing kitchens where no one knew my name. Now it's your turn to stand there and listen. Brandon lowered his head, but I didn't stop. I won't throw you out of this party, won't ruin the evening, but I will tell the truth, not for you, for everyone here who helped me survive to this day. I turned to Emily and gave a small nod. She retrieved a wireless microphone from the reception desk and handed it to me in silence. I stepped onto the small stage area. A soft light fell across my shoulders. Every guest had stopped moving. I looked around the room, this place that was once only my dream, now real and threatened by the very people who once refused to believe I could survive. I took a deep breath. Thank you all for being here tonight. This evening isn't just the opening of Sophia's table, it's also a day for me to honor everyone who lifted me when I had nothing. But before I speak of that, I want to mention two guests who weren't invited, but who came carrying something called memory. I glanced down at Michael and Brandon, standing frozen in place, then continued. This painting is beautiful, but it cannot erase the years I was treated as a burden, told I didn't deserve a chance. And today, when everything has come together, they return not to apologize, but to claim a share. A few murmurs rose in the back. I didn't care. I looked directly at my father and brother, my voice firm but clear. Thank you both for coming, because in your distant absence, I was forced to learn how to stand. Because of your coldness, I built this place without anyone's handouts. Then I bowed slightly to the crowd, microphone still in hand. Tonight, we celebrate, not revenge, survival. I paused for a few seconds, letting the silence settle over the room, letting my words sink in. I looked around, not seeking sympathy, not expecting pity. I stood there simply to tell the truth. I want to begin tonight by thanking two women who taught me that love doesn't require conditions, and strength doesn't mean hiding every wound. One is my mother, Sophia, who never lived a day for herself. The other is Aunt Carol, who opened her door to a child denied by her own family, with trust and with every penny saved from her small grocery jobs. Aunt Carol sat in the front row, her hand over her chest as if steadying her heartbeat, her eyes wet but proud. I smiled at her, then went on. The New York Culinary Institute isn't an easy place to get into, and even harder if you don't have anyone supporting you. I applied, wrote my own recommendations, proved my skills. But there was one thing I couldn't do at the time: pay full tuition. I brought the papers to my father's table, hoping he would see the effort I'd put in. I looked toward the left side of the room, where Michael sat in silence, hands clasped at his stomach. His face expressionless, though his legs twitched as if he wanted to stand and leave. He refused outright. Not because he couldn't afford it, but because, in his words, "If I let you go, Brandon will feel inferior. I won't let him lose face." That was the reason. Not because I didn't deserve it, but because I wasn't the priority. I paused, inhaling deeply. Behind me, Lucas gently squeezed my shoulder. Emily stood firm at the counter, her eyes locked on me, steady, as if giving me courage to keep going. I left that house with nothing but a small suitcase and an old photo of my mother. I lived with Aunt Carol, who never turned away, though she had no obligation. She scraped together money, called friends, asked for small loans. Thanks to her, I paid for my first semester. The rest? I worked every day, from early morning until late at night, washing dishes, mopping floors, serving tables, memorizing recipes. No one remembered my name. No one knew where I came from. But I was there. Some guests lowered their heads, some touched their glasses lightly, as though swallowing the tightness in their throats. And when I graduated, I didn't go back. I stayed, I worked, I kept learning, step by step, slow but steady, until the day I could put down a deposit for a place like this. Sophia's table, a place where anyone walking in would feel like they've come home to a real family meal. I turned to face my mother's portrait beside the piano. If you're watching me from somewhere, Mom, I hope you know I kept my word. I've lived by what you taught me. Never let anyone say you can't, just because you're a girl or just because you're different. My voice lowered, but every word was clear. And if someone asks me whether I resent my father, the answer is no. Because without that refusal, without that cold stare, without being shut out of every family plan, maybe I would never have learned to stand on my own. Maybe I wouldn't have been strong enough to endure the heat of New York kitchens, calm enough to juggle 4 orders at once in a Michelin-star restaurant, or brave enough to open this place. I turned back toward my father and brother, my voice heavier. So thank you, Dad. Thank you, Brandon, for not choosing me. Because of that, I was forced to choose myself. No one spoke. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. A few sighs echoed from the back. In that moment, I saw clearly the eyes turned toward Michael and Brandon, no longer curious. It was a silence heavy with shock. A look anyone who's ever been hurt would recognize, part empathy, part unforgiving truth. Brandon's head hung low, gripping the bouquet he had carried since the beginning without letting go. Michael leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed, as if holding himself together by sheer will. But I wasn't waiting for their reactions. I had said what I needed to say. I bowed slightly, set the microphone on the table, and turned back to Lucas and Emily. Neither spoke, just quietly stepped up beside me. No further explanation was needed. Those who had been part of my journey understood, and those who had just returned, silence was the clearest answer. After a few minutes in the back to steady myself, I returned to the stage. Not because I was weak, but because I needed to stay sharp for what came next. The room was already stirring again, as if no one wanted the heavy air to linger too long, but I knew every eye was still on me, and the 2 figures standing frozen by the wall, Michael and Brandon, knew it too. I lifted the microphone, my voice softer now but still clear. Thank you all for listening, and for being here with me on such a special night. Before we begin the main course, I have one small thing I'd like to share. I drew in a long breath, then turned toward my father and brother, walking slowly in their direction. Every eye followed my steps, Some guests even pressed their hands lightly to their chests, as if to steady their heartbeat. I stopped in front of the two men who once were my family. They said nothing, only looked at me with a mixture of caution and expectation. Brandon gripped the bouquet so tightly the roses began to bruise. Michael kept his face hard to read, but in his eyes flickered a faint satisfaction he could not hide. I smiled, a small, measured smile. I spread my arms and slowly embraced Michael, then Brandon. The hug lasted just long enough for everyone in the room to see, short enough that I didn't feel suffocated. They hesitated, then raised their arms to return it, probably believing they had just been forgiven publicly in front of dozens of witnesses. I released them, still calm, then turned back to the room, microphone in hand. Tonight, when I saw my father and brother arrive, I was surprised. But then I thought, perhaps this is an opportunity for me not to rebuild what has already broken, but to close a circle that doesn't need to exist any longer in my heart. I paused briefly, then continued. Because Brandon came tonight and because he brought the gift of an offer, of partnership, I'd like to respond with sincerity. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Several people lifted their heads, waiting. I officially offer Brandon a position here at Sophia's table. Not as a partner, not in management, because those roles require long-term commitment and skills we don't yet see. But I'm willing to give him the chance to start in a role that suits him. I turned to Brandon, my tone still gentle. Brandon, starting tomorrow, if you agree, you'll take the role of bartender at this restaurant. We'll guide you through the process. You'll have the chance to learn. If you do well, more may open up. But first, I want you to begin where I once had to begin, working with your own two hands. Applause broke out. Then more joined in. The room warmed with energy, as if this were a touching reconciliation between family members long separated. I kept smiling. Brandon forced a grin, but his eyes betrayed unease. Michael tilted his head slightly, his jaw tightening as if swallowing down a protest he couldn't voice in front of everyone. Lucas stepped forward, laid a hand on Brandon's shoulder, and said politely yet firmly, "Tomorrow, 8 a.m., I hope to see you on time at the bar station. We'll have a uniform and shift schedule ready." Emily appeared beside me with two sample cocktails in hand. She offered one to Brandon. "Welcome to Sophia's table," she said, her smile brief, but her eyes alight. I no longer looked at Brandon's reaction. Instead, I returned to the center of the room and faced the guests who had truly come for me. Tonight we've prepared a special menu, a blend of memories I've carried my whole life, and the creativity of a team that never gives up. Each dish is a story. Each flavor is a journey. Please, enjoy. Guests rose, glasses clinking, chairs sliding back softly. The dinner continued, and from the far side of the room I could still feel my father's gaze. Not pleased, not angry, but something tangled, shame laced with bitterness. He had thought their presence would change the story. He hadn't expected that I no longer lived inside their story. Brandon still stood there, one hand holding the cocktail, the other tightening around the rim of the glass. His eyes were lost, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. I had no comfort to give, no explanation to offer. Everything had already been said through words, through actions, and through the silence at the right moment. I glanced at Lucas. He lifted his glass in a quiet toast. Emily flashed a thumbs up before turning back to greet more guests. I drew a cloth from my apron pocket, wiped a ring of water from the bar, and set my unfinished glass back down. Inside me there was no more anger, only a steady calm, like someone standing in a hot kitchen for hours, yet still preserving the perfect flavor of a dish. Some meals must be simmered for a long, long time before their sweetness emerges. And some tables, no matter who sits down, will always remind you that some people are only guests. Nothing more, nothing less. The evening ended close to 10 p.m. The lights dimmed, a few groups lingered over dessert, Conversations faded into soft laughter, then melted into the gentle jazz from the ceiling speakers. I stood near the bar with Lucas, reviewing the reservation list for the coming week, while in my mind lingered the image of my mother's portrait now hanging on the wall, her eyes seeming to watch me without blame. Emily passed by, touched my shoulder lightly, and tilted her head. "You okay?" I nodded faintly, but inside I knew the night was not finished. About 15 minutes after the last guest left, while staff tidied up, I stepped outside for air. The April night breeze was soft, carrying the scent of new wood and lavender from the planters by the porch. I pulled out my keys to lock the side door when Michael's voice cut through the dark, cold as if he had been waiting there for an hour. "Can I speak with you?" I turned, unsurprised. Brandon stood beside him, his composure from earlier gone. Both of them looked at me like men holding back too long, ready to burst with just one word. I didn't answer. I crossed my arms and faced them. Michael stepped forward, his tone heavy. "I just spoke to a lawyer. Using your mother's name for this restaurant without family consent, that's a violation of personal image rights." I laughed, not out of humor, but because the brazenness still had the power to surprise me after all these years. "Family consent? You mean the man who cut all ties with her for 10 years? The man who never once visited her grave for 7 years after she passed?" Brandon snapped, his voice sharp. "You slapped Mom's name on this emotional stunt, then used it as a shield to humiliate us in front of everyone? You think that makes you noble?" I looked at him, my heart turning cold, as if I were back in La Lumiere's freezing storeroom. "I didn't humiliate anyone. I spoke the truth. If it hurt, it's because it was too accurate." Michael stepped closer, fists tightening. "You'd better think carefully. A civil lawsuit isn't cheap, and the press loves to dig into scandals around local celebrities. Do you think you can withstand that kind of pressure?" I didn't step back, didn't look down. My voice was steady. "The only person with the right to use my mother's name is me. She gave me life. She taught me how to cook, not you. And if you want to take it further, go ahead. But remember, I'm not the 16-year-old girl crying under the staircase anymore." Brandon clenched his fists. "You've always been like this. Acting so noble, so righteous. Pretending you're the victim when you're the one who broke this family apart." I slipped the keys into my pocket and turned toward the door. Brandon shouted behind me, "I won't let you disgrace us like this." He lunged, hand out as if to grab my shoulder. Lucas stepped out just then, saw the scene, and strode over, his voice low and edged. "You'd better back off." Michael caught Brandon's arm before it went too far. Brandon jerked free, shouting, "Why are you just standing there? She humiliated us in front of the whole town." I turned, my face steady. "If either of you comes near me again, I won't say another word. I'll call the police, and I'll see it through." Michael's jaw tightened. Brandon backed away, breathing hard like a cornered animal. I didn't look away until they both turned and strode down the brick path to the parking lot. No apology, no backward glance. Lucas stayed beside me until their figures vanished behind the trees. He looked at me, his voice soft. "Want me to ask security to double shifts tonight?" I nodded slightly. "Just to be safe." He said nothing more, only placed a hand on my shoulder before heading back inside. I lingered for a moment, watching the streetlights reflect against the restaurant's glass. Inside, staff were still cleaning up, dishes clinking faintly. Another life was continuing quiet, steady, needing none of those men who had just left to be complete. I pressed a hand to my chest, my heart still beating evenly, without a tremor. Inside me there was no hatred, only boundaries. And once those boundaries are set, they never move. Backward again. I thought it had ended that night when my father and Brandon left, when I returned to check the oven's heat and told Emily we should change the cilantro for tomorrow's soup. I thought I had closed an old chapter, but I forgot. Some people, once they lose control, will do anything to drag others down with them. About 3 weeks after the opening night, I began to notice something off. A few regular customers canceled reservations at the last minute. A young couple, arriving for their booking, looked at me with hesitation. I greeted them as usual, but they didn't return the familiar smile. Emily was the first to speak up. 2 tables tonight. Both ordered the specials but barely touched their food. It felt like they weren't here to eat. I looked up from the kitchen counter. What do you mean? She handed me her phone. On the screen was an anonymous post in a local community group. Don't be fooled by appearances. The owner of Sophia's table mistreated her father and brother, then used her mother's death to make money. She even humiliated them in public. That restaurant isn't as clean as it looks. I read every line slowly. Beneath it were nearly 200 comments, sharply divided. Some defended me, others doubted. But what mattered wasn't the words, it was the name behind them. I didn't need an investigation. I already knew Brandon. Emily gripped the strap of her apron, watching me, waiting for a reaction. But I wasn't angry. I was tired. A kind of tiredness that didn't come from my body, but from having to face the kind of toxicity I thought I had already left behind. Lucas pulled me outside that night. We sat on the back steps of the restaurant, where I had planted pots of basil and rosemary for the kitchen. He handed me a cup of hot cocoa instead of wine. What are you going to do? I looked at him for a while. I won't stay silent. But I also won't lower myself to play their game. The next day, I called an old friend in the media. She had once worked for an online food channel and had followed my journey since my days studying in New York. I asked her, if I release a video telling the whole story exactly as it happened, no exaggerations, no theatrics, do you think anyone would listen? She answered with just one line, with the way you live and work, millions. We started filming the following week. I wore my chef's coat and stood in the main kitchen of Sophia's table, right in front of my mother's portrait. No background music, no effects. I just told the story. About my mother, about my father, about being denied tuition support, about working in New York, about why I built this restaurant, about that opening night, about the embrace that was never forgiveness. At the end of the video, I said only this: I'm not telling this so people will pity me. I'm telling it so that someone out there who's been hurt by their own family knows they're not alone. 3 days after the video went live, it hit 1 million views. The press picked it up. A local TV station reached out for an interview. The story spread across social media, not because it was shocking, but because of the calmness and honesty in every word I spoke. Brandon fired back with a long online post, trying to prove I had fabricated everything. But the video was clear, recording every moment from the opening night, from my speech, from his own reactions. There was nothing he could argue. A week later, Brandon was fired from the bar where he worked. Michael, too humiliated, stopped showing up at the community meetings he had once attended so actively. The people who once praised baseball legend Michael Carter now mentioned him only with pity in their eyes. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt lighter, as if small stones had finally slipped off my chest, letting me breathe fully for the first time. By the end of that spring, the second branch of Sophia's Table opened in Chicago. This time, not in a small town, but in the heart of the business district, where I had once walked past fine restaurants I could only admire through the glass. Aunt Carol came to cut the ribbon. She wore a deep blue coat, scissors in hand, standing beside me and Emily as friends, staff, and even honored city guests applauded. Lucas stood behind the new bar, raising his glass, his eyes shining with unmistakable pride. As everyone moved into the banquet, I slipped quietly toward the entrance. On the newly mounted sign, the name Sophia's Table was engraved in bronze with a small line beneath, a place where strength is served with kindness. I placed my hand on the sign, breathing slow and deep. Then I whispered softly, not for anyone to hear, but for my mother to feel wherever she might be. Mom, I did it. I stood there for a long time, not because I needed witnesses, but to remind myself that every effort, every wound, every silence I had endured had led me here. A place not for revenge, not for boasting, just a home warm enough for those who had once been dismissed, once been pushed away from the table, to now hold their heads high and live in their worth. Family life, as you can see, isn't always safe. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those we call blood, and sometimes the arms that aren't bound by blood are where we find peace. The important thing isn't who abandoned us, but who never left when we were at our lowest. And what about you? Have you ever been hurt by your own family? Do you think someone like Brandon can ever change? Or have you had to speak up to defend yourself in the middle of a fractured family? Share your story with me and with everyone who needs to know they are not alone. I read every comment, every line you write, because every story deserves to be heard. And if this journey has given you even a little faith, a brief moment of courage, hit follow. There are still so many more stories waiting to be told. Raw slices of family, of wounds, of how we piece ourselves back together again.